this evening. I'm here to talk about funding inequity and how it has affected myself and my peers. Underfunding has kept my peers and I from receiving the best education with the most updated programs and technology. This does not prepare us for the real world when it comes to jobs, as students might have already gotten all the material and met all the criteria that they would have gotten in high school, while students who have that are underfunded will have to receive this information and education while in college, and this sets us behind. It has affected my district in a whole bunch of aspects. Last year we had two programs on the chopping block, which were the music and arts program. By not having the exact funding and fair funding, it affects my peers and I because we wonder, will our sports and programs be cut? The programs and sports have shaped us into who we are. These things being stripped away from us due to unfair funding would change many lives of my peers. And I just want to make sure that I'm calling all PA citizens to speak up about this issue, and I'm publicly asking our legislators to fix this right away. Please do not wait for years. This needs to get done now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I think I'm sure I speak for more than just myself when I say that hearing from students about how this has affected them is more impactful than hearing. It sure is more impactful than hearing from school board members. It's more impactful than hearing from probably even, administrators and teachers. It's just like, it hits right where you almost can't deny it when students are saying it. And so I think that it's really important. So thank you. So David, as I mentioned, David works with Power Interfaith, and David has been working on this issue for, I don't even know how many years, David, 10?
Me personally, about 6.
Okay, so I will just say the video that David created probably 4 years ago or so, I believe it's 2017 maybe, is a video about fair funding, and it helps to show the racial disparity in the funding. And it was the video that made me finally realize that this is an undeniable injustice, and not just an injustice generally, but a racial injustice. And so I have used that video over and over, but I'm really glad that he's here with us today, just to be able to share with the numbers as they are right now, and just to be able to present that live and in person. So David, take it away.
All right, Laura, I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my screen? Great. Okay. So I am going to give what is essentially an updated version of that talk that Laura referred to on the YouTube video I made about 4 years ago, that shows the extent to which Pennsylvania's system of public school funding is inequitable and unjust, and in particularly has a stark pattern of racial bias in how funds are distributed to public school districts. There we go. So how did it get to be this way, that Pennsylvania has such inequity? This issue actually made national news about 5 years ago. There were stories covered in the Washington Post and the Huffington Post, among others, and from which these graphics were taken, where there was a national analysis of how all 50 states funded schools, and in particular, how the funding for students in wealthy districts compared to the funding for students in the poorest districts in each state. And this particular study, and reflected in these graphs, is from comparing the per student funding from all sources for the poorest districts versus the wealthiest districts. And what they found is that some states across the country that are shown in blue on the map and in the bars on the right-hand side of this graph, these are the states that on average fund poorer districts at a higher per student dollar amount than wealthier districts. And that really makes sense to do it that way, because in fact it costs more to educate poorer students. It just takes more resources to compensate for various factors that tend to be characteristic of poorer students and poorer school districts. So you have states like Indiana that in this year, in 2015, was spending on average 17% more per student on its poorest districts than its wealthiest districts. On the other side, you had about half the states, shown in orange and red on this map, that spend on average more on wealthy districts and less on poorer districts. And you can see there's just one state that's lit up in red on that map, and that's the tallest bar in this bar chart, which is Pennsylvania, representing the fact that Pennsylvania on average in 2015 was spending 33% less per student on its poorest districts compared to its wealthiest districts. And as you can see on that graph, it's worse by a long shot. It's not even close to the second worst district of how big that gap is in Pennsylvania. So how did it get to be this way? Why is it that there's this big inequity in how Pennsylvania distributes school funding? To start with, it's good to understand what the sources are of public school revenues to fund public schools. And all over the country, public schools are funded primarily from a mix of local funds and state funds. Local funds tend to be raised in the school district and spent in the school district. They tend to be primarily raised through property taxes. And as you can imagine, wealthier districts are able to raise a whole lot more money through their locally taxing themselves on properties, for example, than poorer districts. And the state, on the other hand, pools money together for public schools and distributes it out to the districts according to whatever method they deem appropriate. And in most states, that means they have a formula that distributes the money to districts according to some measure of their need. The first problem in the inequity in Pennsylvania's funding is represented in this bar chart. The fact that the overwhelming majority of the funding in Pennsylvania, over 60%, is coming from the local level, and only a relatively small portion, about 35%, is coming from the state. So that 60% is going to be totally dependent on how wealthy individual regions are. And as we know, there's huge variation in wealth across regions, and that those changes in wealth do tend to reflect historical racial patterns that were at one time coded into laws, Jim Crow laws, later coded into things like redlining and restrictive covenants that restricted where people of color could live, where they could get mortgages, restricted which schools they could go to. And so they tended to cluster in areas that had less wealth, and those patterns remain true today. So that's one source, is that Pennsylvania simply is relying way too much on local funding and not enough on state funding. And it hasn't always been this way in Pennsylvania. Back in the 70s, Pennsylvania was providing around 55% from the state level and a smaller part from the local share. And the average across the country is about 50-50, but Pennsylvania is now in this state where only about a third of it is coming from the state. So that's one piece of the problem. The second piece of the problem is the way the state spends this 35% of the money that they are distributing to public schools. And that's an opportunity for the state to compensate, at least partially, for the inequities in local wealth. And unfortunately, the way Pennsylvania distributes this 35% of public school funding is deeply problematic. Actually, before I even go on to this slide, let me just say that, and before 2015, Pennsylvania was one of only 3 states that didn't have a formula to say how they should distribute their state dollars to public school districts. So every year it was up to the state legislature, to the politicians, to negotiate and decide how to divide up the money among the districts. And as you can imagine, that didn't always end up well and fair for every district. So in 2014, the legislature and the governor did a good thing. They appointed a basic education funding commission to study and make recommendations on a funding formula that would give a rational, systematic way of how the state should divide up their share of the money. And we'll get into that in a minute. But I want to show that I got into this area around this time in 2014 and did some analysis that Power published at that time that revealed the stark racial dynamics of how Pennsylvania was distributing its school funding at that time. This graph is showing the per student funding from the state on the y-axis and the poverty rate of each district on the x-axis. Each one of those circles represents one of Pennsylvania's 500 school districts. And you see this kind of general trend that the points go kind of diagonally up to the right, indicating that there's a rough trend that Pennsylvania at that time was giving somewhat in general more money to poorer districts than to wealthier districts. And that's a good thing. That's what they need to do to be compensating for the local disparities in wealth. And that black diagonal line is reflecting the general trend that poorer districts are generally getting more money from the state. The really troubling thing, though, is when we look at the racial composition of the districts, and that's indicated by the coloring of the dots. The state's half of the districts, the 250 districts that are the whitest in the state, are colored yellow. The other 250 districts that have more students of color are colored brown. And you can see that nearly all of the yellow dots are above the line, meaning that those districts are receiving more dollars than would be expected based on their poverty rates. And the districts below the line are nearly all districts with more students of color, and those are districts that are receiving less than would be expected based on their poverty rate. So really stark pattern. And I did get to present this data to the Basic Education Funding Commission at a hearing they held in Philadelphia in 2014. And they took this in, and it was part of the data they considered in creating the formula. So the good news is they finished their work in June of 2015, and they published their recommendations for a funding formula. So the good news story is that Pennsylvania now has a fair funding formula. And from all sides, they got great reviews on this formula that they came up with. It tells how to divide up the state funding across the 500 districts based on the actual needs of each district, including factors like how many students there are in the district, how many of those students are living in poverty or deep poverty, how many of those students are English language learners. These are all things that affect the cost of educating students. Also has factors about the districts. What is the local taxing capacity of the district to raise money locally? Is the district in a rural, sparse, spread out district with few students that increase their costs? So a bunch of these factors and others went into it and give a rational, objective way to divide up the pot of money among the districts according to their actual needs. So at this point, the legislature was faced with a poignant choice that reflects the choices that I think society always has to make when confronted with issues of racial justice. The choice was, does the state now distribute their dollars fairly according to this formula, or do they preserve the privilege that some districts, many districts, have been experiencing, getting more than their fair share of the formula? And those districts, as you'll see in a moment, as you kind of already got a hint at, are overwhelmingly whiter districts. So what did the state decide to do? They decided to freeze the funding at 2015 levels for all future years, and any increases that the legislature allocated to public education above the 2015 budget level would get distributed through the fair funding formula. So that first year, it meant 97%, I think, 98% of the funding was distributed in this old, racially biased, inequitable, irrational way, and 2 or 3% was distributed fairly. We then had another few years of additional money being added into distributed through the formula. So as of last year, as of the 2019-2020 school year, you had 89% of the state funding being distributed the old, inequitable, unfair way, and just 11% of the state funding getting distributed fairly through the formula. So it's kind of mind-boggling to think of this as a solution to the problem. Imagine if the Montgomery bus boycott, inspired by Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat to a white person on a bus, were solved by the Alabama Bus Company saying, well, we're going to keep all our current bus lines with seating for whites only, but any new bus lines that we add on in the future going forward, we'll let blacks to sit wherever they want on those buses. That's kind of the solution that the Pennsylvania legislature has implemented into law, and that's been the way it's been. That's the way it's been for the last 4 years or so. So I want to show you what the impact of that is on how it actually impacts the dollars that are going into school districts across the state. This graph is comparing what each school district is getting, was getting in the last school year in 2019-2020 compared to what the formula says, Pennsylvania's own fair funding formula says it should get according to its fair share of the funding formula. And by the way, the reason we're looking at last year's numbers is that for the current school year, for the 2021 school year, the legislature actually didn't use the formula at all. They just froze the funding levels at exactly what they were last year. So that's why we're looking at last year's numbers. So what you can see is if districts were getting funded fairly, getting the amount that the formula says was their fair share, each one of those blue dots would be on that diagonal line. The diagonal line represents fair funding. Any district whose dot is above that line is getting more than their fair share. Any district below is getting less than their fair share. And you can see hardly anyone's on the diagonal line. Like nearly every district is getting either shortchanged or getting a windfall, some of them by huge amounts of money, thousands and thousands of dollars per student. So that in itself is troubling. But what's really troubling is then when you look at this through a racial lens, and we do that by color coding these points by the racial makeup of the districts. And that's what's shown here. And you can see pretty clearly that the further above the diagonal line you get, the whiter the circles get, meaning the whiter the districts get, and the more windfall, the more above their fair share each district is getting. And similarly with the dots below the line, these are districts that are getting less than their fair share of funding. And these are mostly the darker circles, and the further you get away from the line, the darker they tend to get. And just to make the pattern a little clearer, here they're colored the same way as that earlier graph, where the 250 whitest districts are colored yellow, the 250 districts with the most students of color are colored brown. And you see that the overwhelming number of districts above the line are the whiter districts, getting more than their fair share. The overwhelming number of districts getting less than their fair share below the line are the ones with more students of color. This is another way of viewing how this impacts individual districts. So what we're seeing here is, there's some feedback there. If someone wants to mute, that would be great. We're seeing each of the 500 school districts represented by a rectangle on this graph. On the left-hand side of the graph are the districts, I'm just gonna get this blocking my view a little here. The districts that are getting less than their fair share on the left-hand side, the ones getting more than their fair share on the right-hand side. And again, the color coding is by the racial makeup of the district. And so you can see that, you've got this giant district, Philadelphia, who's in terms of total dollars is getting shortchanged the worst. Although, as you know, other districts that are smaller are getting shortchanged even worse on a per student basis. But the real clear thing to see here is that the left-hand side is dominated by these dark rectangles, meaning districts with high proportions of students of color. And on the right side, it's exactly the opposite. Tons of districts that are very white. So how can we see what this means, look at this trend a little clearer and see what it means in a per student impact per district? Here's each of those 500 districts plotted in a way that compares the district's inequity to their degree, their level, their proportion of white students in the district. And by inequity, I just mean the difference between what this district was receiving from the state last year on a per student basis compared to what the FAIR formula said would be its fair share of the state's funding. And you can see that and these circles go from left to right. from the district with the most students of color. And as you move right, the districts are getting whiter and whiter. And the size is roughly reflecting the size, the number of students in each district. And so you see this really clear pattern that on the left, nearly all the districts are below the line, meaning they're getting less than their fair share of funding. That big circle's Pennsylvania, and then you've got some of the other big urban districts, Allentown and Harrisburg and such. The one exception to this rule is Pittsburgh, which is a district with lots of students of color that for some complex political reasons and demographic reasons is the exception by getting more than their fair share. But just about all the other ones follow this rule that as you move to the right, the districts get whiter and their funding gets more and more favorable till you get to the right, and you can see all these highly white districts getting way more than their fair share of funding. So to quantify this, we break up all these districts into 5 bins that have equal numbers of students per bin. So there's a lot more of those highly white districts in the purple bin, and fewer districts are needed to add up to the same number of students in that blue bin on the left. And then we can take the average inequity for each of those bins. That's shown here, just taking an average of each color. And just it's a little simpler to understand that same data plotted here on a bar chart. And each of these bars represents one of those bins. The leftmost bar is the 20% of students who are in the least white districts. And you can see that those students are shortchanged an average of $2,240 per student compared to what the formula says would be their fair share from the state's funding. And as you move to the right, you're getting to whiter and whiter districts. So you get to the rightmost bar, which is the 20% of students in the whitest school districts in the state. And those districts are getting on average $2,234 more per student than their fair share. And think of that, that's a whole lot of money. You know, in a 30 student classroom, you're talking over $60,000 per classroom that the districts with lots of students of color are getting shortchanged, and the whitest districts are getting as a windfall in their state funding. This pattern of racial inequity has actually been getting worse gradually each year that the formula has been in place. So this is the data on the most recent school year for which we have data. This next slide is showing that same analysis from the first year that the formula was in effect, 2016-17. And here, the least white districts were getting shortchanged by only about $1,900 a student. And similarly, the whitest districts were getting a windfall of $1,900 a student. And I'll just go back to the graph of last year, that has increased to over $2,200 per student. And that might seem counterintuitive because after all, they froze the base and then we've been distributing a little bit of the money fairly. Why would the inequity be getting worse? And the reason is that base that's frozen is continuing to distribute the dollars the same old inequitable way, but the demographics in the districts keep shifting so that the districts who are getting less than their fair share, many of those districts are growing in the number of students. Many of them are getting poorer. Many of them are getting more English language learners, and none of those factors are impacting that base level of funding. So the difference between the fixed frozen level of funding and the fair funding for those dollars is growing each year. Just to show that race is just one dimension that you can look at this data, and I've looked at it with a lot of different dimensions. This, I think, is the other most interesting one, is to look as a function of poverty. So this is showing the same kind of analysis, but dividing the school districts into 5 bins, not according to the racial population of the students, but according to the percent of poverty in the school district. So on the left is the wealthiest districts with the lowest levels of poverty. And on the right are the poorest districts, the 20% of students in the poorest districts. And you can see that those poorest districts, represented by that rightmost bar, are getting shortchanged by about $2,300 per student, about the same as the least white districts were getting shortchanged. And that's not a coincidence. Those tend to be mostly the same districts, the poorest and the least white districts, not exclusively, but largely. But the pattern here is very different. When you get outside of that poorest quintile, you can see that all other demographic bins, when they're broken up according to poverty levels, are actually benefiting or getting more than their fair share of funding. So yes, the poor districts are getting slammed by this failure to use the fair funding formula, but it doesn't have the same monotonic impact and consistent impact across all levels of poverty the way it does across all levels of race, where the whiter the district, the more favorable the funding. So I'm going to show a couple of examples of how this impacts districts by comparing two districts here, the York City School District and the Commodore Perry School District. These are two districts that last year got about the same amount of funding from the state per student, about $8,500 per student from the state funding. And yet, these are districts with wildly different needs. The York School City District, as represented by the lavender bars, its fair share of last year's state funding would have been about $15,000 per student, and the Commodore Perry's fair share would have been $2,700. But they're both getting about $8,500 because of this inequitable distribution. You know, York is a very poor district. Its median income per family is below $30,000. More than 45% of its households are living in poverty. Whereas Commodore Perry is kind of an average school district. Its median income is around $50,000, about 16% in poverty. And consistent with the pattern we see across the state, Commodore Perry is with this big windfall, is 98% of its students are white, whereas in York, about 11% of its students are white. Another example that's closer to home for many of you on this meeting, comparing Pottstown School District and Penn Trafford in Western Pennsylvania. These are two districts that also got about the same level of funding from the state, about $3,600 per student last year from the state, and yet they have wildly different needs. The Pottstown School District has a 39% poverty rate. It has, compared to Penn Trafford's 5%, has a median income of $45,000 compared to Penn Trafford's where was I? Median income compared to Penn Trafford, $74,000 per student, per family. And yet they're getting the same amount because the state is barely using the fair funding formula. So the last slide I want to show is says something about who the winners and losers are, and looking through a different lens, which districts and which legislators are benefiting or losing dollars based on this inequitable distribution. And I should preface this by saying, you know, everyone's really losing when students aren't getting the resources they need to get a good education and be able to live into their full potential. So there's no doubt in my mind that the entire state is suffering as a result of inequitable funding. But just looking at the narrow definition of winners and losers, of who's getting more dollars and who's getting less dollars, starting with the leftmost graph here, we count this up by school districts. And what you see here is that far more school districts are benefiting from this unfair funding. 354 districts are getting more than their fair share, and only 146 are getting less than their fair share. You might think that that makes it a bleak prospect to ever change the system because you have more winners under the current system than losers. But a really important thing to know is that most of these 354 districts getting more than their fair share are very small districts with very small number of students, and therefore not that much political representation, whereas most of the larger districts are in this loser category. So if you go over to the next part of the graph for students, you see that substantially more students are getting shortchanged than are getting a windfall. 914,000 of the state's public school students are getting less than their fair share compared to 790,000 who are getting more than their fair share. Similarly, if we look at both houses of the legislature and you look at how much each legislator's, the district and the fraction of the districts that they represent are getting from the state in basic education funding funneled to their constituents, a small majority in both houses are actually getting less than their fair share. There's 26 out of the 50 senators and 102 out of the state representatives that are actually getting less money to their constituents than the fair formula says they deserve. So that offers some hope that there might be the political will to do the right thing by motivating people by their narrow financial interests when that's necessary. So I'm gonna stop there, and maybe I'll just summarize real quickly. My main points is that the inequity in Pennsylvania's funding stems from two main causes. One is that too much of the funding comes from the local level and not enough from the state level. So the state really needs to increase the amount of funding that it's putting in to public education at the state level. And secondly, the state needs to do the right thing and distribute the money that it is distributing, whatever amount it is, whether it's the current amount or the increased amount they should be distributing, and distribute it according to what they themselves have as their own fair funding formula, so that all students are valued as equally precious and equally deserving of an excellent education. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for sharing all of that. So I have an initial question for all of our participants here in the Zoom meeting, and that is, after absorbing all of that information, and I definitely understand that it is always a lot of information. Every time I listen, I pick up on something new. But from what you did pick up on, what feelings or emotions are kind of standing out to you? Like, what's your gut level takeaway from that? And anybody can go, whoever, and if nobody does go, I'm happy to call on people, of course. Irene, go ahead. You need to, you're on mute though, Irene. You're on mute.
Icon for it. How do I do it?
Oh, you're good.
What do I do?
You're good now. You can answer the question. You went off mute.
Okay. My school district does not have a high number of Black students. What we have are transient students and that have broken homes, but that's not primary. We just don't get considered for being mostly white and getting the more money. That we don't fit into that category at all. So that study, I was very good. It was very interesting. I did, but I think I knew that before. It was well presented. An awful lot of work went into it. However, it didn't apply to my school district. And I've been on my district as a board member for 12 years. This is my 12th year. And prior to that, in New Jersey for 12 years when we lived in New Jersey. So I don't even think that would apply to the previous school district in New Jersey because it was primarily white. Their money problems were not near as bad as what we have at Panther Valley. We are a composite of 4 towns. And when I graduated from one town, there were the same number of graduates as we have now in 4 towns. So we don't have jobs available, very few, and people travel out of the area for their jobs. And it's a wonderful place to live, however, if I'm describing the overall beautiful Pennsylvania typically. And but we don't fit in with your study. But I truly realize what problems you were talking about.
Thank you.
I wonder how we could fit in on something that would give me some signal or something to go on as trying to get more from the state. And we have had a lawsuit against the state with other districts. I don't know if you're all aware of that, and that's for fair funding.
Yes.
So I thought I would have connection here, but I see it's a racial position that we're talking about.
Well, and I think it's worth mentioning that whether or not a district fits into that kind of trend of racial bias, you're still being harmed if you're underfunded. So, I mean, I'm glad to hear that you're part of that lawsuit, and I continue to hope that that, you know, brings some really good results.
I don't
Go ahead.
I think we have problems with the politicians. Exactly. That I think would be our solution, to have them get more money. Now, we were told that the governor's sitting on $1 billion. I don't know if he still has that left, but there is the source, if that's a true statement. And where it can go, I don't know.
Any other feedback or yeah, Nancy? Oh, you're on mute. It's the slogan of 2020. You're on mute.
I apologize. I'll never get used. I hope I never have to get used to it. I live in Bucks County. I should preface by saying that I was a New York City public school teacher and administrator most of my life. So I know New York better than Bucks County. But after hearing David's presentation, my response is, why would I want to give up all the money that my wonderful child gets? I mean, I would have to be crazy. But I know that that's not fair and that's not equitable. I also know that in this time where we're beginning to open up our eyes, it seems to me that this is the best time to work on the idea of a more appropriate definition of hurt, who's getting less than what they need. And I know that Bucks County and the schools very close to where I live are going to be losing some money that they don't actually need. And it's time. It's time.
But as you said, it's so hard for people to give that up.
These are my babies. These are my greatest natural resource. But I was walking once in Brooklyn, New York, where I worked, and a father bringing his child to one of the best schools in the city, about third grade. They were talking on a level that I could not understand about Wall Street. And I said to myself, that kid's got it made. He doesn't even need a school at this point. And I'm done.
Who else? Gut level feedback. Paul.
So my gut level feedback on this is we're going to have to tackle it, but I don't think it's, I think it's a two-part problem. There's the fair funding formula, but also the percentage of funding from the state to the school districts, right? That because the inequity, even if we put everything through the fair funding formula, wouldn't solve inequity in Pennsylvania. It would just push it, you know, the inequity now would reside at the local taxing level. So one of the things I think that could solve in both of these is if we found the appropriate level of funding and revenue at the state level from the state to these school districts, as we implement the fair funding formula, then you'd have less of an impact to those districts that would be, you know, as you process that through the formula, they might not get the same percentage in that formula, but they might get the same dollars, right? So to the point Nancy was making, you know, maybe it'd be able to hold those school districts from getting, they wouldn't get less money, but the Pottstowns and these other school districts that are underfunded would then receive that fair funding as we push out everything from the state through the formula. So if we did that and balanced it that way, and we looked at what's the appropriate level of funding from the state, and we do that at the same time you implement fair funding, and when we put these steps together, you dilute the impact it would have negatively on those districts that have the higher funding, right? So it's kind of bringing everybody up and then trying not to have a large impact on that. And I think that might find some political will there because you have less harm.
Right. I assume there would still be school districts. I mean, there are some school districts that are getting $6,000 more per student than the formula says they would. I would just.
Yeah, you're never going to make it perfect.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, but you're gonna. It's just a matter of, and it's not going to be all or nothing. But you
Right.
can make progress.
Anybody else? Diana?
So I'm amazed at everybody coming up with these wonderful solutions and we should do this, and because all I get out of it is my poor kid and the poor kids in our district and the poor kids in the districts around us that are struggling, because I'm coming at it from a different perspective than, you know, it's not fair, it's not equitable, it isn't, but it just makes me sad. Like, I'm angry, but it makes me sad. Like, you know, I see it firsthand, all the things that we don't have that other districts do. And all the things that we are fighting, little things that we're fighting to pay for, to do, to make sure that our kids get what they need and things like that. So I'm just coming at it from a different perspective.
Yeah, that's a very real perspective, though. I resonate with that. A lot of times my feedback coming away from it is, this just makes me mad. It makes me so mad. And especially that we've had this formula now for 4 or 5 years and we're still here and the inequity has grown. Like, it just makes me mad.
Oh, and Karen, I went to Liberty in Bethlehem. That's where I graduated from. So
Anybody else? Maybe 1 or 2 more people?
I just want to say something about the politicians, because I think that's one of the main problems. Politicians that represent districts that are getting more than their share they don't want to lose the election, so they don't want to take any money from their districts. So I think Paul's idea that he had is an excellent one, in order to make the blow a little less, just make the blow a little bit less to those districts that would need to be losing some money, because the state has held this hold harmless thing for so long that they're not going to take money away, and they need to take some money away. It's just unfair, and they talk about how unfair it would be to take money away. It's not unfair to take money away, because these districts don't need that much money. And so, I mean, there needs to be a balancing act, and people need to get real about this issue, because they're harming kids every day.
Mm-hmm. Karen?
I really appreciate what everybody else has been saying, and come away feeling angry and disappointed, and, you know, by the condition itself, but also by the fact that it's getting worse, just sort of blows my mind. And how much these two pieces fit together, just like we've been talking about. It's about insufficient state funding, step one, plus state funding being distributed inequitably, only making matters worse, just is why Pennsylvania ranks so out of the bounds in terms of what richer districts and poor districts receive. And I really appreciated that last slide that talked, you know, that had winners and losers. And so much of this conversation is in terms of districts, which sort of understates the severity of the problem that we're talking about. Well, you know, a smaller number of districts are underfunded than are overfunded. But you look at that, and nearly 1 million Pennsylvania students are in districts that are underfunded. Most Pennsylvania students are in schools that are underfunded. Vast majority of minority students in Pennsylvania are in districts that are underfunded. And that's what really sort of, you know, you get mad at through the entire presentation, but you get to that part to realize that the way in which we've been talking about this too almost makes it harder to sort of grapple with the severity of what we're looking at. So that's all of those things.
Good.
Hey, Laura.
Yeah.
There was a question asked on Facebook that was directed towards David. And if David, if you don't mind, if I direct that question towards you. The question was, That the question was, what is a favorite state that you could use as a model in terms of equitable funding? Like a state that we could kind of point at and say, hey, that state's doing it right versus our state, which is clearly not doing it right.
I have to say, I'm not very expert in any other states other than Pennsylvania. So all I could say is that, first of all, any other state is a better model than Pennsylvania. I think New Jersey does a pretty good job of this, but I am sorry, I don't have a lot of detailed knowledge of it.
Well, that's good. I mean, that's not necessarily a bad avenue to go down in terms of when we're sort of looking at ways to fix this problem, looking at some of the other states. I mean, wasn't it on the other side is Indiana, right? If it's Pennsylvania's on one end, Indiana's on the other end, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't, yeah, so that might be another one to look at.
I think that graph is exactly what you can look at to solve this issue, because it shows the states that are giving more to districts that need it and the states that are giving less. So that graph would answer that question if someone would study it.
Yeah, although one of the things that's not reflected in that graph is how the diversity in demographics is a lot different in different states. So I think Pennsylvania, and what contributes to Pennsylvania's disparity is that Pennsylvania has a lot of wealth disparity, and probably much more so than Indiana does. And so that's reflected in property values and school taxes and therefore school funding. So you might not be able to fix the problem in Pennsylvania by doing what Indiana does.
And I know another part of that too is how much overall a state is spending per student. So you might have in Indiana, they might still spend, and I'm not saying that they do, but they could spend less overall and still move up higher on that chart just because they proportionally spend more on their poorer students, but overall they're just not spending a lot. Like I know if you go down south, there's a lot of states that do not spend a lot on education overall, but they're still higher than us on that chart. So it kind of like, there's so many things that seem to play in terms of equity, if that makes sense. So I think I'm going to pull up a slide that I have. I have a few questions beyond just the gut level ones. Okay, I want to know if anything there, hit present. I want to know if anything in the presentation surprised anyone. And so if there was anything that you were like, I had no idea about that, or I did not realize that there was a racial bias or whatever, was there anything that was especially surprising? And again, I do realize that a lot of folks in this meeting have heard this before. Every once in a while, I still hear something. Karen?
Just that things are getting even worse. That, we're now maybe 5-ish years into having had a fair funding formula in place. And in the midst of that, funding is only getting more inequitable, is just sort of is astounding.
Yeah, it is.
For me, I've seen the presentation before. And I do agree that things are getting worse. And I do appreciate the fact that, okay, some states are not going to want to lose money because they want their money, they need it. But here's my take on it. Anytime that you have extra money, you can't spend it all. So you have to have the surplus somewhere, okay? So I would assume that some of these districts have extra money sitting somewhere that they're using it for whatever they're using it for. Because of COVID-19 and the changes that all school districts have had to make to be online, and that things are not normal right now, I would think that the legislators could use this time now to try to fix the problem, because now everybody will start at a different level once the COVID-19 issue goes away, whenever that is. We will start off differently because there's a lot of things that we're not going to be able to do, or there's a lot of things that some school districts are going to need. So I think for me, because of COVID-19, even though the funding is not there, we are all starting at an even plate once we start. And I think that this would be the opportunity to make the changes necessary to help our students and to be fair for everybody. That's what I think.
So kind of like you're suggesting this is an opportunity for a reset.
Yes.
And kind of on that point, I have heard it said before that sometimes equity is best achieved in the lean times, because that's where everybody is right now. I don't know how that will play out for us with this situation, but I thought that was an interesting observation because it does provide a little bit of a reset. So, I mean, I think it's an optimistic way to think in any case.
And you know what, Laura, once we go back to what we think is normal school, things are going to be different, because COVID-19 and being remote and has provided the tools necessary for school district to offer different class settings. So a lot of things are going to change. And because of that, I think this is the best time to try to fix it. Is it going to happen right away? Probably not. Are the legislators going to listen to us? Probably not. You know that I met with some of the legislators and nothing's happened. But I think that we're missing the opportunity now to help our students, and I don't think we're going to get it again.
This is also the time that the data out there showing the difference between the wealthy school districts and the poor school districts, and when they could get online and do their, actually be educated at home would be very important, I think, to show the difference between the rich and the poor when it comes to education. And, you know, the Lower Marions of the world starting on March 18th to be educated, and Pottstown starting sometime in May. I think that's good data for this, for what you're talking about, Josie.
Yes, I agree with you.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, as we talked about data and kind of what it looks like is, we're taking a point in time here. This is like this year, right? This measurement. But remember, these kids are in school for 12 years. And if the average is that, $2,600 per student in those poorer districts, or the least funded districts, and that's a lot of kids, times 12 years, they have a $30,000 disadvantage of inequity just on the state portion of the funding. It's probably much more than that if you lay in the property tax differential too. So you're talking, these kids are $50,000 and $60,000 worth of resources that have gone to their counterpart, their peer in another district, for no other reason than the zip code they live in. So you have that, and it's a kid, right? So it's not a school district we're underfunding, it's a kid, and we're underfunding him his entire career in school, and it's cumulative, year after year, day after day. The other thing you got to remember in some of these districts is, we're all on virtual, a lot of us now, and if mom and dad are working and they're outside the home, and I don't live in a neighborhood or community with a lot of resources, where are our kids at and who's helping them? Versus if I'm in Lower Marion, Upper Marion, and I got a tutor or a pod and I got someone at home that's helping. It's there's so much advantage. We're starting some kids out on second and third base, and these other kids we're holding back, and it's children. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think we got to make the impact is not $1,000 or $1,500. It's way more than that, and it's a cumulative impact and a cumulative harm over my entire career when I get out there. And that's something we got to correct, because it has an economic impact on communities. It has an economic impact on Pennsylvania, and we got to do something about it.
Yeah, and we're talking about the 1 million kids right now that are underfunded for school year 1920. What about all those that are already graduated that are unemployed? We're not counting those. We're just counting the current data. We've hurt a lot of kids. Like you said, we impacted a lot of careers. This is just not fair.
Anyone else want to jump in? Maybe anybody who hasn't, somebody who hasn't said anything yet? Go ahead, Irene. You're on mute.
Pardon? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I am interested in these representatives of their school districts, and if they can quote now, one by one, how many fall sports they have to give to their kids. Because usually that is one area, if you're short on money, the sport goes, the coaches' salaries go, equipment and referees. But I would really be interested how many sports that are in their scheduling for this year.
I feel like that might be a difficult one right now, especially because of everything being shut down. So some of that varies, but I do know that that's true. I mean, certainly in Pottstown, not just sports, but the number of programs we offer is absolutely affected by the fact that we're underfunded by $4,000 per student every year. I mean, and we've seen over the years programs get cut because there wasn't funding, and they don't come back then because our underfunding has only grown and our expenses sure aren't shrinking. So yeah, I think your point there is right on.
Well, the truth is there are many, many students that will go to school, stay in good standing if they can play a sport. That's absolutely true. And I am still interested if one by one we can state how many, even with COVID, how many sports are being actively performed in their district.
I don't necessarily want to take the time to go around one by one, but if everybody wants to raise your hand, if you feel like that's been affected, I'd be curious to know. Personally, I can't tell you how affected it's been in our district just because I haven't seen it go over the years. But
well, here's a good indicator. If we struggle with in our district providing the essential educational tools to be able to support our kids, and I can look down 422 about 10 miles down the road and see a school district that is not concerned so much with the artificial turf field and all-weather track that they have now, but replacing it and getting a second one, and then also getting a baseball diamond that is artificial turf. And that's the discussion of the day in that district, not what educational programs can I provide for our kids. So to that, to that point, that's where I see the difference. Not so much, not the athletic piece of it, but the overall piece. If that's where the energy and that's where the surplus money exists to do those things, and we can't even provide basic educational programming for our kids, there's a problem. And Paul's right. Listen, everybody, I think, who spends any time looking at this issue has to be appalled with the discrepancies that exist, and clearly the discrepancies that exist between predominantly white schools and schools that are weighted towards students of color. And I've spent plenty of time talking to lots of people, including a number of legislators, about unethical, immoral, and other aspects of the funding the way it exists. That, quite honestly, I agree with Paul. The political will to change this, I don't think exists. Even under the most recent spotlight of bringing to light the equity justice issues that exist in our country overall, I just do not think that that's going to move the legislators of Pennsylvania to change and say anything that even vaguely sounds like we're going to, in order to equal things out, we're going to take from A and give to B. I'm hard pressed to believe that other than forcefully being made to do that, which isn't going to happen. So to me, the biggest hang up to moving forward is hold harmless. I don't think hold harmless is going to go away. Taking all the money 100% through the formula at least provides for the underfunded districts, provides more relief. Does it provide additional for the hold harmless people? Yes, I suppose, but at least it moves me forward. It is not my preferred method of solving the problem though, because I think it still perpetuates the problem. And from the strictly economic part of it, in a community like ours of about 22,000 people, most of which are in what are identified as low income families, with a median family income of someplace around $45,000, asking the members of our community for over $30 million a year. Pottstown School District ask our citizens for over $30 million a year just to provide even the basic of basics. And that has created a considerable tax burden. What does that tax burden mean in the long run of perpetuating the cycle? It inhibits people from wanting to buy homes in Pottstown. It certainly is a factor that prevents companies, businesses from wanting to locate in Pottstown. So it just puts us deeper and deeper into the cycle. And all of the almost 1 million plus students in the state of Pennsylvania that suffer through this, and the long-term effects are felt not this year, not next year, 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, 20 years down the road. That's the part that really makes me mad. And right now, fighting the battle, I would be happy with, hey, let's put all the money, 100% of the money that comes in every year, put it through the formula.
I don't understand how that's different than eliminating hold harmless.
Well, if we stay, good question. I think those are two separate things. I said, I don't think we're going to get rid of hold harmless.
So if you don't get rid of hold harmless, then you're not putting all the money through the formula.
All right, I'm not sure what my logic was there. I have to rethink it. Give me a second, David.
All right, we could talk about it offline.
Okay.
Could I add another comment though about the direction that Paul suggested earlier, which I think is ultimately going to be the necessary direction, which is to simultaneously both add money into the pot and distribute it fairly. I definitely think that's the right direction, but just some of the challenges moving in that direction, two of them. One is that many districts are getting so much more than their fair share that any reasonable increase in the pot, if the pot gets fairly distributed, will still leave them with a decrease. And as two examples, Council Rock District, which is represented by this call, it would take more than $4 billion more funding in order for, when it's distributed fairly, to give Council Rock just the amount that it's getting now, because it's getting so much more than its fair share. And with Pittsburgh, it's even more extreme. It would require $6 billion increase. And the current amount, by the way, is about $6 billion. So you'd have to basically double the state's investment in basic education funding in order to not decrease Pittsburgh's funding if you distributed all the money through the formula. So that's a challenge, but I think not insurmountable. I think, the way you stated it was, you can ease the pain on those who might experience a decrease. And I think that's the right way to do it. And for a lot of districts, you would be protecting them from a decrease. And then of course, the second challenge is that, redistributing doesn't make a demand on revenues. So redistributing is tax neutral. As soon as you talk about increasing the size of the pot, now you need to get those dollars from someplace. And so now you're asking, generally speaking, unless you got some other clever ways of finding money, of raising tax revenues. And so you got to get people to get behind that.
Yeah, and I think you're right, David. But you know, it's about the balance, and I don't think you're going to get to the neutral position. It's probably not a realistic move in the political scheme. But if we get, you know, incrementalism is you know, I know not everybody likes that word, but if we get halfway there, you know, if we get to 50% of the formula and we get a little bit of revenue move, whether it's moving from other sources or however that's done, but I think it's going to be less than ideal, and everybody's going to feel some pain. There is no way we're going to balance it out so every school district's happy, right?
Right.
But if you took the, you know, in your graph, the middle 50% and got that on the line, you know, that's a huge advance for equity in Pennsylvania. And those outliers are the outliers, but you've now, you know, halved the amount of kids that are disproportionately funded through the state, you know, and I think that's and then you look to fight the next battle the next day, you know.
Yeah, I think that's right. But just be careful, because I think the general public views what the state has done already as incrementalism and an incremental big step in the right direction, because we have a formula, we put more money through the formula each year, we're solving the problem. And that's not actually how it plays out. So I think you're right that is the way to do it, but you have to take a really careful look at the numbers and not agree with anything that says it's an incremental improvement.
Diana, did you have something? I had seen your hand up before.
Well, I was going to address Irene only because she was talking about sports, and I don't even think that's like on my radar, the sports part. I'm looking more at the fact that like our high school has what, 7 AP classes? 7. I know Liberty has like 20 some, I think. And like we have 7, we offer our students 7 AP classes. That is so much more vital than anything else, you know, that we're offering. And so when she was talking about sports, I immediately think of like the musical and music and art, because those are important to me. But just thinking like AP classes, like that is huge.
Right. No, I hear you. I mean, I think it can be reflected in all of those areas. Nancy?
I am reality based, but I want you to know that what I think what I'm about to say doesn't show that. Council Rock School District came up with a statement as a result of the death of
George Floyd or?
George Floyd. Thank you so much. It's hard to get old. And the last part of the statement is, yeah, but the consequences are so bad. Consequently, we acknowledge that we must look at our own school priorities and practices through an anti-racist and equity lens to address traces of racism and inequity that still exists within our school community. There is hope. Because I think the possibility is to go to this school district and say, my mother used to say it, you got to put your money where your mouth is.
That is exactly what I thought as you were saying it. I'm like, show me the money. Like,
show me the money.
But still,
I have
agree.
hope.
There is, I agree. There are things that do make me hopeful. Now to see it play out and to see people actually put their money where their mouth is different. But the first step is kind of like becoming aware and acknowledging the problem that is there. There's no hope without that. So I'm glad that we are where we are, to the degree that there's a lot of people who are now realizing there is a problem, who did not realize that there was a problem before.
Yes.
So I'm going to end with a question, at least end the question.
Hey, Laura.
Yeah.
There was a comment made on Facebook that I just wanted to
Thank you.
Someone had said something that another way to think about it is that the state has chosen to have no rationale whatsoever in distributing basic school funding. This is bad management. No other department of government would be allowed to spend money with no rationale.
Wow, that's kind of scathing and true. So what I kind of want to end with is I'm going to ask David first, but I'd be curious to hear other thoughts. Not to put you on the spot, David, but I'm curious to hear what you'd say. What right now is making you hopeful about this issue? If anything, please tell me something is making you hopeful.
No, definitely.
I need that.
Well, I'll say a couple of things. First of all, what makes me hopeful is groups like people on this call who are really fired up and passionate about setting things right for kids and representing a diverse group of school districts. That's super important. And so that makes me hopeful. The other thing that makes me hopeful is the real sea change we've seen in public awareness about racial inequity as it manifests in policing. And, you know, this is not to talk about radical, eliminate police departments. It's just to say that inequitable oppression of Black youths within the justice system has been happening for a long time. But in the last 5 months, it's gotten everyone's attention and people actually care about it. And people actually say that's not right. And I think if we need to figure out how to capitalize and ride and leverage that awareness and consciousness and outrage to say, this is the same thing. If we won't stand for violence against our Black people in the criminal justice system, why would we stand for symbolic violence against our students by withholding resources from them? And the fact that we've seen people wake up to that gives me hope.
That's good. Anyone else have something that's making them hopeful? Myra.
Well, what's making me hopeful is David's presentation. And I have a question about it because I would love to be able to use that. But I couldn't, the way it's sent, you can't, can you send it so that we can have it and use it in another presentation? Because
the one I sent you, were you not able to open?
I'm able to open it, but I'm not able to use it. It doesn't say read only, but it says.
Yeah. Right. Okay. We can figure that out, or maybe it's easier if Dave. I don't know. We'll figure that out afterwards.
All right, because I'd like to have it. Thank you.
Yeah, and any of you are welcome to use those slides and present them on your own or extract from them to use in any way you want.
Thank you. We've benefited greatly in the past from doing that. Irene.
I'd like to say, David, that's very generous of you. You did all the work and here it's going to be utilized by so many, but that must give you satisfaction. But I still want to go back to my issue because I did ask the question. I would like to know, and I know we're hampered by the COVID situation, but when we are really pressed for money, it usually is, the issue is directed toward eliminating a sport. And I think this is a quantification of somehow depicting the differences of our districts. And I can see it by, hearing and listening to what is said, but still, I will go last if anybody wants to speak up and state it. I know it. I know there are boys, girls that will stay in school, try their best to please their teacher, so their average is acceptable to be on a sport. So this, I want to say, is a definite issue to stay in school, to be successful. And could I still ask the question?
I really don't want to do that during this part because I want to wrap it up. But since we're staying on the call afterwards, maybe that's something that could be discussed more then.
Okay. But I did include any activities. I don't know the woman whose name.
Right.
She has a backdrop of some art situation there. There you go. What is your first name? Doesn't matter. But
Diana.
Pardon?
Diana.
Okay. Thank you, Diana. And should I wait for another time?
When we're done with the live portion, I was going to have the participants stay on the call anyway, so maybe we'll talk more then. But I want to wrap up the fair funding discussion, as it were. Is there anybody else who wants to offer something that makes them hopeful? Anybody else?
Another issue is the taxing of the people, the millage they pay.
Right. No, that's definitely been a big issue too.
Big.
I will say something for me that makes me hopeful is it kind of what David said first, is the number of people who I'm seeing get interested in this issue and take action in various ways. It is incredibly encouraging as we've been kind of trying to reach out, because I know in our town we had been involved in advocacy around this for a while, but to get connected to other districts and other groups and organizations is just, you can just feel the, I don't know, the extra power that comes from being in it together. I just am very encouraged.
I think one thing that makes me hopeful is young members like Angelica who get fired up and speak with such authority. And I mean, when a bunch of us older folks are talking, it's all like, yeah, here they go. But when Angelica talks, people listen. So that makes me hopeful. That makes me think she's definitely looking out for what's going on, what can be fixed, and looking to put together solutions. So that makes me very hopeful. Sorry if I lumped us all in as older people. I apologize.
Oh, we are. I've accepted it. So I'm going to, let's see if I can get this back. I'm trying to share something but struggling. So give me a moment.
Are you having a Zoom moment?
I am. Sometimes I get in here and I'm just like, what is happening? Why am I having trouble? Okay, let me try this again. I kind of want to do a little kind of closer, just asking what we can do, because I mean, and honestly, we've talked some about this. I assume everybody can see this, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. We've talked about some ideas about how this could work, and I always love hearing the kind of policy ideas. We've talked at times in some of our meetings about what could be packaged together so that it was, most palatable to the greatest number of legislators and all of that. And so I love all that, but I also sometimes like to boil it down even further so that for those of us who aren't legislators or soon to be, hopefully legislators, we have ways we can take action. And so I'm going to go through a few of the ones I was thinking of earlier. And the first one is simply to vote. And that is to pay attention to the folks that you're voting for. Don't just ask what they give lip service to, but ask what they're actually doing or what they actually plan to do if they're not an incumbent. If somebody is an incumbent, you should be able to look and see that they care about this issue, not just see that they give lip service and then tell you that it's too hard, because that is so common to have people say, yeah, I agree. It's, I'll even co-sponsor, but there's no drive there to get it done. And the reality is that a lot of people don't have that drive because they don't think it can get done. And I think we should look for people to vote for who want to figure out a way to get it done, to take that as part of their job to get it done. So certainly in this upcoming election, the first thing we can do is make it be a part of how we vote. The next part I was going to mention was just to join the Pennsylvanians for Fair Funding Facebook group, because there are action items in there, probably on average once a week, but some weeks there's several and other weeks there might be none. And they're action items that often involve calling a legislator about something related to equitable funding. Sometimes it is something different. It could be sign a petition, it could be something else, but often it is a matter of reaching out to your legislator. the next thing is simply to share what you've learned with people in your circle. And that could involve presenting a workshop yourself. It could involve sharing a video of a workshop, but it can also just be in conversation, and it can also be with legislators. You know, if you are calling someone and telling them, hey, look, you represent me, that is your job, here's what is important to me. And then last but not least, if you are watching this or in one of the participants here, and you're interested in either starting a group or becoming part of a group that meets regularly to talk about advocacy and to work on practical ways to do that, reach out to me or to Ray on Facebook, or you can email us at pa4fairfunding@gmail.com. And that email is like a brand new email that we just created just so that we would have a spot for people to reach out, but certainly Facebook's okay too. Okay, and any questions about those action points? Okay, well, I think we're gonna close it then. I really appreciate everybody being here. Thank you especially to David and Angelica. And hopefully we'll see you all again soon doing some kind of advocacy work.
Thanks.
All right, I'm gonna end the stream.
That's fine. And then for everybody who's on this, remember to stay after. And we'll see if there's anything we need to do to debrief.